Good evening. Thanks for joining me tonight. Tonight, I would like to share with you the story of prisoner H56325, my father, Philips Douma, and his time in the concentration camps during World War II. My father spoke very little about this dark period in his life, as it caused too many emotions and nightmares. However, as his children, I have a brother and two sisters. We always had many questions about this time. So eventually, in May 1995, when we celebrated 50 years liberation of World War II in the Netherlands, he took an old typewriter and wrote down his story. It's a privilege for me and our family to share this story with all of you in New Orleans in the US of A. The reason is twofold. Firstly, we will be forever grateful for what the United States and the Allied nations have done and the many sacrifices made to liberate us in the Netherlands and the rest of the world in World War II. Only because of that, I'm here right now with you. As my father would say, never, never forget what they have done for us. Secondly, the story is a powerful story of how faith pulled people through some of the darkest hours of history. That is something for us all to reflect upon, but also something important to share with our children. So here is the story as told by my father. It starts in Hayem. It's 1939, 1 year before the start of World War II. We lived, and that means my father and his parents, in a small village called Hayem in the north of the Netherlands, in the province called Friesland, a special province with its own language. Our family worked for a local farmer, almost a tradition in those days, in these little townships. One day the farmer insisted my parents, so that means my grandparents, would send my brother and sisters and some of my sisters to the public school in town, as there were too few children attending that school. Till that time, they were attending a Christian school in a nearby village. If they would not comply, my father, so my grandfather, would lose his job. They were determined though and didn't want to consider this option as well. So they took the consequences and decided to move to another village called Pietersburen, working for another farmer and sending their children, so meaning me and my brothers, to the local Christian school over there. I had decided around that time I didn't want to continue working in the fields on a farm. When I read an advertisement in the local newspaper that a course for policemen was given in the neighboring town of Franeker, I was quick to apply. Meanwhile, on May 10, 1940, Hitler and Nazi Germany attacked the Netherlands, and war broke out. Fighting lasted only a few days for our small country. Then ordinary daily life for our family returned, and we didn't notice much of the war in the relative remote north of the Netherlands. However, everything did become scarce and more expensive. It was the summer of 1941 that I started attending the course for policemen, and in the spring of 1942 I passed the exams without any problems. Soon I could get an assignment in The Hague, a major city in the southwest of the Netherlands. But given the German occupation, I doubted to apply. I checked in our local village with both the chief of police and our pastor at church for advice. Both thought I could take the job, and of course I really wanted to get away from working at the farm. The decision was made. With hindsight though, this didn't turn out to be a good decision. The Hague. So this is how my career with the police started, with my first assignment in The Hague. It was quite an event, because I'd never been outside Friesland, this province in the north of the Netherlands, where I had grown up. At first, as policemen, we didn't notice much of the war. We could do our work, which largely consisted of surveillance by bicycle, in complete freedom. I had good friends in The Hague, and there were also quite a few colleagues from Friesland. On Sundays, I could regularly attend church. I also went to confirmation catechesis. It was at church I met the family De Graaf. I often would come to their home. Later, when I was in the concentration camp, several members of the Graaf family would visit my parents' home in Friesland. All in all, I had a good time, but in the remainder of the war, it didn't get any better. Sometimes there were bombings, and we noticed that the Germans were starting to get tricky. Almost unnoticed, I got involved in illegal activities. For instance, we had a boss who would ask us to do some secret work. The Germans wanted to arrest doctors who didn't want to cooperate with them. A friend from Friesland and myself received a list of names of doctors who would be arrested the next day. We saw a chance to warn them all. Eventually, only 4 doctors were arrested. The Germans were furious and ordered an investigation. Shortly thereafter, the population register of The Hague was bombed in the middle of the day. These were direct hits, and the whole building burned down. The records that had survived the fire were transferred to a nearby city. We were then tasked to monitor and stand guard at this building during the night. As part of our illegal activities, we were now being asked to remove specific records from the card boxes in the register. These records were of people wanted by the Germans. The paper cards had to be burned on the spot in the stove. The thinking was that no one would miss those records, because most of the building had burned down anyhow. Later on, and following some other activities, it appeared that I was placed on a list of unreliable persons. The arrest. It was September 16th, 1944. That morning, I was on duty at the railway station together with a colleague from Friesland. We saw a train with destination Leeuwarden, a major city in Friesland. I told my colleague, I believe it's time to go into hiding. I have a feeling that things may go bad for us soon. He thought it would be okay though, but I watched that train take off with regret. Once back at the police station, the doors behind us got locked. We had to line up in its central square for a roll call. Suddenly Germans from all sides entered the square. It turned out to be the Grüne Polizei. We were soon surrounded and their weapons were pointing at us. Our chief appeared with a German officer. He started yelling at us, calling us saboteurs and saying that we would be transported to Germany to work there. They took away our pistols and we got transferred to the so-called Alexander barracks. We were allowed to receive a visit from family or acquaintances. So I got a visit from the De Graaf family, the ones I knew from church, who had been so good for me in The Hague. They promised to send my greetings to my family in Friesland, and then they said goodbye. All not good, and we were in great trouble. During the evening, German army trucks arrived and we were loaded up. With 2 heavily armed German soldiers seated at the back of the truck, so no escape possible, they took us from The Hague to Camp Amersfoort, a prisoner camp located in the middle of the Netherlands. The stay in Amersfoort. Once in Camp Amersfoort, it turned out that there were about 80 police officers arrested, both from The Hague and Amsterdam. We were housed in barracks. Our money and possessions were taken, as well as our uniforms. We got old worn clothes and a camp number. On our first day, there was an attack by English fighter planes. 1 prisoner got killed and several got wounded. It was a bad start and prospects were not looking good. Every day there were many hours of roll calls, and we also saw some of the Jews who were being abused. The food was not bad, mostly stew and sometimes a package from the Red Cross. In comparison to the camps later in Germany, Camp Amersfoort was still a heaven on earth. Every day we saw English fighter planes attacking and firing at the local railway station. This was also the time of the railway strike in the Netherlands. Despite this strike, the Germans still managed to get transports going to Germany every week. Early on, in October, a large group of men, around 600, from the village of Putten, were brought into the camp. It was very sad to see them all enter the camp. A totally discouraged group of often fathers, sons, uncles, etc. They were all arrested in a raid on their village. You have to know, a German officer got killed in an attack by the Dutch resistance just outside their village. The Germans were furious and arrested the whole male population of the village between 18 and 50 years old and burned down around 100 homes. I got to know these men from Putten as very religious people. We often sang together, which was always very encouraging. It reminded me of Paul and Silas, who also sang at night during their imprisonment. Religious meetings in Kamp Amersfoort were absolutely forbidden, but on Sunday evening we gathered in a secret place in one of the barracks. One of us was put outside as guard to warn in case of danger. It was so encouraging to still have such a gathering. A pastor amongst us, who would be preaching, said, "I've never been able to preach so well as I'm doing now, knowing what it means to be oppressed." He would read for us one of the Dutch hymns. I feel through the closest connection, in that hope connected with him, that my faith will hold his hand till my last breath, and no power of death and grave ever pulls me away from Jesus. After an evening like that, we would fall asleep, feeling encouraged again by our faith. After a few days in Kamp Amersfoort, we heard cannon roar of what we thought the approaching liberation. We also saw enormous number of planes and gliders that carried out the air landings at Arnhem as part of Operation Market Garden. We were convinced that the liberation was near. We saw the Germans preparing to leave. This day was called Crazy Tuesday in the Netherlands. Within Camp Amersfoort, people already started to talk about a possible takeover of the camp by the Red Cross, and we, as policemen, would ensure an orderly course of events. Unfortunately, the next day, the Germans were back again. Operation Market Garden had failed, and there were many hours of roll call. A few days later, it was announced that the transport to Germany would take place on October 11. The destination was not announced. On the day of our departure, it was one big crowd, around 1,400 people. We had to line up and were all given a small package of bread for the next 3 days. We left the camp walking in long lines to the railway station in Amersfoort. On our way, some citizens still had a chance to give some of us some food. Under heavy surveillance, we had to board a long train, which was waiting at the platform. It was a passenger train with German soldiers in every wagon to guard us. The doors were locked and the train, pulled by a steam locomotive, left. Being so long, the train was first very slow. We were only just outside the station when we heard shooting. Later on, we heard that some people had had a chance to secretly unhook the doors of one wagon. As the train took off, they jumped out and immediately let themselves roll into the banks along the railway, so that no one could get seriously hit. The train didn't stop, but drove on, and slowly reached higher speeds. Escape was no longer possible. The train ride. The train began a long journey and stopped every so now and then when air alarms would go off. The German guards then left the train and carefully closed the doors. At a great distance, they would go into the fields with their weapons pointing at the train. English fighter planes would fly over the train at low height, but they didn't fire. Would they have known this was a prisoner's transport? Probably yes, because normally no locomotive was safe anymore those days for attacking fighter planes. Once the planes had left again, the train continued until we arrived in the city of Apeldoorn, located in the east of the Netherlands. Another air alarm happened and the whole thing repeated itself. We stayed here the rest of the day. With us was a young man from Apeldoorn. Suddenly he saw his father cycling along the road. The man got completely upset and got removed from our compartment. By night, a few guards took me and some others to the locomotive in front of the train to help the train driver loading coal and burning the fire. Air alarm went off again. All lights went out and I saw only one German soldier standing next to the locomotive. We were right next to a broad canal. There was a road on the other side, and I saw the lights of houses across the street. At that time, I seriously considered jumping off the train into the canal and swim across to these houses. In the end, though, I didn't dare to take the leap to freedom. With the locomotive finally loaded with coal, the train journey continued that night. The next day, we arrived in Germany, and in the city of Hamburg, we saw the first signs of the devastated bombings that were taking place in all the major German cities. A few hours after Hamburg, we arrived in concentration camp Neuengamme. I will never forget in my whole life this arrival. We saw a large complex of buildings and barracks, surrounded by watchtowers and barbed wire at high voltage. At the entrance there was a large stone gate with the inscription in German, Arbeit macht frei, work sets you free. There we also saw the name of the concentration camp, Neuengamme. Furthermore, we saw prisoners walking around in striped clothes with bald heads. We got very frightened by all of this and lost hope that everything would turn out well. Under loud shouting by the Germans, we had to leave the train and line up on a big square. We were chased into a large building where we had to undress completely naked. According to the Germans, that was necessary to remove any lice. Other fellow prisoners who were already there had to shave our heads bald. Afterwards, we had to lay down on a big block. All our pubic hair was shaved off, which was a bloody affair for some, given the blunt knives. In my whole life, I've never seen and undergone something so bad and humiliating. There were, for instance, fathers, like the ones from Putten, with 3 sons who also had to undergo this. These were terrible scenes. Then we had to go to another building where we would get a shower. That was indeed what was happening, but equally well they could have gassed us, which happened to so many of the Jews. After showering, we got a jacket and pants. My prisoner number was next, H56325. It got sewn into my pants. Thus began a long and frightful agony, the end of which we didn't know and could not suspect. We were housed in barracks and were given a bunk bed with 4 men. It was a bed without any blankets, and sleeping was not easy at first. During the first days, lots of roll calls happened on the big square, where thousands were lined up. Counting took hours, because apparently it was never right. The food consisted mainly of watery cabbage soup, and sometimes very bad boiled potatoes. Every day in the camp started with music by a music corps of prisoners. They made a tour of the camp and played at the gate when the work commandos left the camp to go to work. One of the marches that got played every day was the well-known Alte Kameraden. When I was home after the liberation, I heard the music band of my hometown play that march as well. It was as if I had been bitten by a snake. I fled the house and fell somewhere in the mud. Till this date, I cannot stand hearing the music of this particular march. After a few days in Neuengamme, we were divided in work commandos and transferred by train to Wedel, a small town close to Hamburg. We were housed in barracks and had to dig huge tank traps under supervision of punished German Marines. These guards didn't bother us, and we tried to work as slowly as possible to save our strength. After some time, though, these men were replaced by young fanatic SS men. These started abusing the prisoners, and soon the first died. An old man from Putten was beaten to death because he was praying for his pan of cabbage soup. He was first warned that praying was not allowed, but he wouldn't give up. In the camp, some prisoners were tied to a pole for a whole day because they had stolen some bread or other food from a fellow prisoner. They would be hanged that evening during the roll call. Day in, day out, there were terrible things happening. As I wrote earlier, we often found encouragement in singing together psalms and hymns. That happened in the evening when we had returned to our barracks, exhausted as we were from all the hard work and the associated abuses. Once we had eaten our watery cabbage soup, we would take turns asking for a psalm to be sung. The psalm would then be sung together as far as there were Christians around, and afterwards we went to sleep. It did sound beautiful when we sang the first night in that camp. Blessed is he who expects all his strength and help from you alone. Psalm 84. Note, this was also the song the men of Putten sang in their church, where the Germans had gathered them in the raid on their village, just before they made their march out. We also sang, Hoping God, for I shall again praise him, my salvation. Psalm 42. The singing created peace in our heart. Sometimes the guards would come in when they heard us singing to look for Bibles, as the Bible was a forbidden book. At the discovery of a Bible, there would be severe punishment. But all the songs were in our heads. No one could take these away from us. This still made us strong. It of course frustrated the Germans a lot. As rulers, they wanted absolute power and taking away our identity. That's why we were numbers for them. There was a man in our barrack who would always leave the room when we sang. When he came back, he said, "How is it that you can still sing of a God of love? If God loved you, he would never have brought you here in this misery. I do not understand that you worship such a God and sing of his goodness." I felt it was the devil at work trying to draw us away from God. And this man made several people doubt. I also had my moments of doubt. Did we deserve this? But when in doubt, we asked God for help and assistance during these difficult times. Hamburg. By the end of the year, 1944, we got transferred to the city of Hamburg, that often got heavily bombed during air raids. We had to clean up rubble and remove unexploded bombs. It happened a few times that such bombs would still explode and kill many. In the bombed houses, though, we also found things to eat. That's how I found dried stockfish. It was a delicacy, and I could enjoy it for a long time. The winter had already started, and it was often impossible to work. We benefited from this, as the food was very bad and only a little. Many died of dysentery and exhaustion. Then Christmas came. We could celebrate Christmas without being beaten, and white bread and honey were presented. We called it bread from heaven. On Christmas night, the prisoners from all different nationalities each sang in turn 2 Christmas songs. Poles, Russians, Latvians, Danish, Norwegians, French, Belgians, Greek, Dutch, and Italians all sang their most beautiful Christmas songs. Especially the Russians could sing beautifully. All sang of the same Jesus, who had come to earth to save sinners. I will never forget the silent night we sang together. During each Christmas after the war, I still experience this miracle. Back to Neuengamme. At the beginning of February 45, we were brought back to Camp Neuengamme. Life further deteriorated. No more singing of psalms in the evening was strictly forbidden. A large number of prisoners got hanged, while the music corps played again Alte Kameraden. It was terrible how many people died every day from dysentery. The chimneys of the crematorium burned day and night. On Sundays, the women and fiancés of the SS guards would arrive in the barracks. They were enjoying themselves and laughing at the naked corpses of the deceased prisoners. I never thought that such people could exist in this world. I have seen fellow prisoners die under all kinds of circumstances. There were those who cursed and slandered God, but there were also those who died while singing and praying. I met a man who told me his whole life story once he felt his strength was fading and his death approaching. He told me that when young he used to go to church very regularly. However, he gave up once he married his wife who didn't believe. As he felt his death approaching, he started to think about his past and asked me if there was still hope for him to die in peace with God. I spoke with him and we prayed together. He died 2 days later. His last words were, "I go to Jesus, my Redeemer. I hear the angels singing." A friend of mine died a few days later. He had asked me earlier to send greetings to his parents if I would make it home. His voice was so weak that I could hardly hear him anymore. But at night, at 12 o'clock, the same boy sung, so clearly that it was a miracle to all of us. He first sang, "In heaven it's beautiful, where one cheers in front of the Lord's throne, with a happy heart, free from all pain and sorrow, where one cheers in front of the Lord's throne. In heaven it's beautiful." Then he sang, "Safe in the arms of Jesus." All who witnessed became silent and were very impressed. Even the ones who otherwise would curse and mock others, those were quiet. There were many of us who were jealous of his death. The boy was delivered from his suffering and went to heaven, where there is no pain nor distress. For us staying behind, we had to live further in this place of horror and the greatest misery. In our barrack there was also a teacher who had somehow smuggled in a Bible. In the evening at 5 o'clock he came to us and read a section, after which we did a prayer for us all. Everything happened very secretly, because as said, it was strictly forbidden to possess a Bible. We've had great support in these meetings. We were gathered there with Catholics, Reformed, and many other denominations. We all found support and consolation in that same Bible. The first time we were gathered, the teacher read from Matthew 5:10-12. "Blessed are those who are persecuted because of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when people insult you, persecute you, and falsely say all kinds of evil against you because of me. Rejoice and be glad, because great is your reward in heaven, for in the same way they persecuted the prophets who were before you." Back on transport. At the end of February 45, during another of the many roll calls, a German officer announced that the prisoners weighing less than 50 kilos could report and would go to a sanatorium in Bergen Belsen to strengthen. We thought the Germans were getting afraid for the approaching Allied forces, because such compassion with the prisoners we had not seen before. Suspecting I didn't weigh 50 kilos anymore, I also stepped forward. However, I was 51 kilos. I got a kick and was summoned to go back to my place. A lot of other prisoners were selected though, and that evening they left in cars of the Red Cross. Oh, we would have loved so much to join them, and many of us had tears in our eyes to see them leave without us. Later, after the liberation, it got known that all on this entire transport, upon arrival in Bergen Belsen, were killed. No one survived. When you hear this, it hits you very hard. After all, I'd done so my best to join them, but I had escaped death. The next day, we were put on transport by train to Hamburg with a large group of prisoners. We were crammed into cattle wagons and the doors got locked. There was no food, no water, and no other seat than just the floor. There was also a bed for our needs, but it could not be used by many because so full as it was. This was extra bad as almost everyone had diarrhea or dysentery. I was suffering from it as well and eventually did my need in an old hat. At that moment the train had stopped and I threw it out of the wagon. I heard it land outside and then a lot of swearing from a German guard. It was clear. The hat with content had hit him. The door of the car was opened and an angry guard appeared, who wanted to know who had caused this filthy situation. He didn't enter the car, but noted my cam number, H56325. Then he said I would be shot upon arrival in Hamburg. It looked very bad for me, and the further journey was filled with great tension and fear. But again, a miracle would happen, and I would escape death. Upon arrival in Hamburg, the train stopped for an air raid. There was a heavy bombardment and our wagon swung back and forth on the rails. Several shells hit the car and pieces of wood flew around. It was a deafening noise of explosions, screams and shouts, and I understood that this bombing would cause many victims. Eventually it got quiet and the door of the wagon was opened. It was a big havoc outside. The locomotive and several cars stood upright and there was fire everywhere. We had to get out of the wagon, and it turned out that there were only a few prisoners injured. The German guard, though, who had recorded my number, was killed. He was laying underneath the wagon. His death meant my life was saved. It turned out that many outside our wagon had died. All surviving prisoners were driven together, and we were taken per foot to an old building. The next day, many prisoners died, as the food became very scarce, and the hunger and the cold did the rest. No one could work. One day, German officers appeared again to select stronger versus weaker prisoners. The weak ones again to be put on transport to Bergen Belsen, again later to be killed. And again, I was not allowed to join. Also here, we heard that they, upon arrival in Bergen Belsen, were all killed. Sandbostel. In the month of April 45, without any inspection, we were all loaded again into another train with cattle wagons, and now we would be taken to the sanatorium. There was a happy mood, because we were looking forward to this opportunity. That turned out to be very different. The train had already stopped often and eventually stopped completely. We didn't know what was going on. The train stood still for a few days, and there was an undefined misery in the wagon. Many prisoners died, but were not removed from the wagon. When the door was finally opened, the bodies fell out. We had to get out and take a seat in chicken carts. They took us to an old barrack camp. It turned out to be an old POW camp, Sandbostel, near Bremen in northwest Germany. Later on, we learned that the train couldn't reach Bergen-Belsen anymore, because that camp had since then been liberated. My life was spared again. This was already the third time I had escaped death. But more difficult days were waiting ahead. The liberation is approaching. In the last few weeks that followed, in April 45, many prisoners died in Sandbostel, almost 300 every day. This is because typhus had broken out. The dead were no longer buried or burned, so a terrible air spread through the camp. This was the toughest time. We had already said goodbye to life. We thought of home, of all who were so dear to us. Would we ever see them again? The guards didn't show up anymore in the camp, out of fear of contamination. The dead bodies were piled up in the corridors of the barracks. To go out, you had to climb over them. With a lot of effort, I also crawled outside one afternoon. You could clearly hear the cannon's roar of the approaching liberators. I then tried to eat grass, because there was no food or drink at all. Near me was a prisoner from Yugoslavia who was dying. He was wearing a thick overcoat. I waited there until he died. Although I somewhat resisted what I was doing, I took off his coat and put it on. I was terribly cold and had almost no clothes on my body. It was a matter of survival, and we were completely exhausted. It looked like no one would be alive in a few days. A few Russian prisoners managed to leave the camp and reach the front. A special unit of the Allied forces was then sent to the camp. I remember the large tanks approaching the camp and driving straight through the barbed wire. A few I'll never forget in my whole life. I saw the Allied soldiers going up the watchtowers and capture the German guards. As survivors, we were so weak that we were unable to greet our liberators in a jubilant manner. We did try to sing together though. Our God is a God of salvation, and to God, the Lord, belong deliverances from death. Psalm 68. The date of the liberation was April 29, 1945. Our liberators couldn't believe what they saw when entering the camp. There was a lot of filming. Local German women were forced to carry the bodies into mass graves. There were many women who fainted in all of this, but the Allied soldiers had no sympathy and they had to continue the sinister work. Please note, upon arrival in this camp early April, we were with 519 Dutch prisoners. In the last 4 weeks, though, only 175 of them managed to survive. Of those, another 20 would die within the next 3 months. Finally, back home. Once we were liberated, an ambulance of the British Army brought us to a field hospital near Bremen. The skeletal bodies of us were washed there. We got a clean pajama and were put in comfortable beds with white sheets. Then it became all dark around me. I was unconscious for several days. When I woke up again, I saw nurses in white clothes and could smell clean white sheets. A strange calm came over me, and for a moment I really thought, these are angels, I'm now in heaven. I'll never be able to imagine heaven more beautiful than this. We were lovingly cared for. I asked the nurse what day and date it was. It turned out to be May 2nd, the birthday of my girlfriend, now your mother and grandmother. That meant even more joy and gratitude. My weight was about 40 kilos, 80 pounds, and I was very weak, but due to the good care, I recovered quickly. I was then transferred to another hospital in Seedorf. A few days later, a column of ambulances of the Dutch Red Cross arrived to take us home. What a joy seeing the Dutch flag! That flag was the ultimate sign of liberation. Hence, still the Dutch flag in the form of a pennant in the garden of our home. Again and again, I enjoyed the look of that and its colors. On our way home, we had to stay overnight in the German farm. The farmer's wife had to prepare a good meal for us, and we slept in good beds. The Germans didn't know what they were seeing, and the farmer's wife pampered us with food the next day. Following several stops and changes of ambulances, it was eventually May 31st that we stopped in front of my parents' home in Friesland. What an event! I was finally home again. After the homecoming. My parents had received earlier the news of my liberation and that I was still alive. A letter was sent to them by an army officer. That letter is still attached to this note. My coming home was of course quite something, and everyone took great care of me. In the months that followed, I slowly recovered. There were many problems with my stomach and intestine. I mainly ate food based on flour, milk, and eggs. Many others in town brought food, as some food was still scarce. I often sat outside, enjoying the sun and freedom, but I was often very quiet and turned into myself. The thought still went to those dark days. Your mother would visit me almost every day and would bring me some goodies. I must not always have been good company for her, as I was very absent-minded. A few days later, after I had come home, we got a visit by the mayor of Putten, the village with the raids I mentioned before, together with another official, showing me many photos of missing men from Putten. I recognized several people, but I could not always tell what had happened to them. A few months later, I spent a couple of days in Putten, with families where I could tell some of the details. When I walked back to the train, people were coming after me with pictures of missing people. What a sorrow and grief in this village. Of the 602 men who were sent to Germany, only 49 had returned. A few weeks after my return home, I was able to go to church again in my hometown. Because of my arrest in The Hague, I'd not made my confirmation yet. An easy chair was put in church because I couldn't sit yet on the normal church benches. Our pastor, Mr. van Urk, spoke after the sermon about the text from 2 Corinthians 1 verse 10. He has delivered us from such a deadly peril, and he will deliver us again. On him we have set our hope that he will continue to deliver us. It was very impressive to me, and I gave my yes word with great joy. Faith in our God Almighty had supported me in the many difficult situations, and it had given me the strength to keep going. After a period of rest, I could go back to work again in The Hague in the spring of 46. Your mother and I got married in October 17th, 46. That was a great day because 3 colleagues, who also returned from the camp, and my former boss, were present as witnesses. They were in uniform and formed an honorary line at the town hall. After the wedding service in church, the national Dutch anthem, our Wilhelmus, was our closing song. We had a beautiful wedding. Closing remarks. This was my story. I still have to leave out a lot, and the writing was not easy, given the many, many bad memories. But I thought it would be good to write it all for you as children and grandchildren. My time in the camp was a time full of sadness and dismay, but also a time of faith, hope, and love. You may now also better understand I am appreciating quiet times and peace around me. Fortunately, I've been able to do my work in good health for 40 years without major setbacks in our family. Now, 10 years into my retirement, I still enjoy our freedom every day. I would like to conclude with the following words. So far, the Lord has helped us. And the words of the following hymn. Thank now, all of us our God, with joyful songs of praise. Our faith is his, and the salvation that we may receive through Christ. He is always offering his grace, and it is him who overloads us with his goodness, day in, day out. Dated Franeker, April 29, 1995. 50 years after the liberation, signed Philips Douma. So, this was the story of my father. A few final remarks from my end. My mother passed away in 1997 at the age of 73, shortly after my father had written this story. My father himself passed away November 29, 2015 at the age of 92. At his funeral, we once more reflected on the miracles that had kept him alive during the war. We reminded ourselves how God had been writing the story of our father's life, and therefore also our story. We thanked our Heavenly Father for this. The angels in heaven, as our father thought he had seen in 1945 when waking up in the field hospital, would now finally be his. And the flowers on his coffin? It looked like his Allied friends were once more with him, as the flowers were coming from the USA and Canada, this time from my shell colleagues in these countries. You can perhaps imagine what it means for me when I can shake the hands and hug the last few veterans alive when I visit World War II Museum in New Orleans. These and many others risked their lives on the beaches of Normandy during D-Day. As a family of our father, we will be ever, ever grateful to the Allied efforts and their sacrifices. We will never, never forget. Thanks for the opportunity to share this story with all of you tonight. May God bless you all.